I'm not sure if any of you know this, but I had planned to go over to Rome for the entire month, as I always do when I'm with the Synod, and I had a family emergency, and my son-in-law had open heart surgery, so I was very much needed back here. So I flew to Rome for one day and turned around and came back when I found out that he had to have open heart surgery. So it was difficult to miss, but also just the right thing I needed to be doing. So I knew I was in the right place. So tonight we're going to look at what happened out of the Synod as best we can. And of course, it won't include everything, but I think we catch a lot of the light. So as you all know, the main objective was to outline paths of in-depth study to be carried out in this conversational style. And the plan is supposed to be completed next session in October. So I want to just go over briefly some important pre-Synod moments. So first of all, changes everything. Women obtained the right to vote. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of how that happened. So in 2015, up in the corner, you see Sister Carmen Samu. She's shaking Pope Francis' hands. Well, she worked really hard at the Synod on the Family to get 3 women religious invited. And so she worked on that. And that year, 1 non-ordained male religious superior voted. So, and we noticed that. So that was important because usually this was it's a Synod of bishops and only ordained people vote. So that was important to note. And then in 2018, the campaign for for votes for Catholic women began in earnest. And so you see up here, we were out in front of the Synod, and Kate McElwee was nearly arrested, which was crazy. But so we were singing and praying, and we almost got arrested for that. But and along with that, in the bottom corner here, we have the tallest woman behind this, in front of this picture of this painting of Pope Francis, is Sister Sally Hodgson. And she's a CSJ, and she was in leadership at the International Union of Superiors General. And she was very much an advocate for women voting at the Synod. So when at that Synod, there were 10 male religious superiors who they always get 10 seats at the Synod, and they get to vote. Well, 2 of them were brothers that year. So again, 2 non-ordained men who have the same ecclesial status as women religious got to vote. So we started to bring this forward and talk about it. And we wanted to equal it at least at that very basic level. Like if non-ordained men can vote, then non-ordained women religious should be able to vote. And so at that time, 10 religious male superiors went to the Synod head and said, we want to give up 5 of our seats, but that didn't happen. So anyway, our campaign began, and we witnessed, and we got a lot of media attention. And I think it was really helpful because it helped educate bishops who didn't know that there were non-ordained religious superiors voting at that Synod. They didn't know that was happening. So it helped raise the issue. People like myself and other people who were inside the press hall raised the issue every chance we could get to educate the bishops about this need to open this up. And then in 2019, the campaign continued. We delivered over 10,000 signatures to the Synod office, Kate McElwee and I and some other people. And we did this little fun light show in Rome with Votes for Catholic Women lighting on St. Peter's Square and various other places. So we had a lot of fun doing that, but also spreading the word and keeping the word going. And then in 2021, there's this woman in the middle holding, shaking Pope Francis' hand, is Dr. Maria Lea Servino. And she was at that time the head of WUCO. And she is a very close friend of Pope Francis. And he had said, to the women, I want you to speak freely. So she wrote an open letter to Pope Francis challenging him basically on quite a number of issues. It was a very good letter. And I think it probably had a lot to do with how things move forward, because she does have that relationship with him in a very special way. And she said, we're not going to be happy with a woman voting. But we also want to see a synod that's really representative of the whole of the church. So we don't want just a synod of bishops. We want a synod of the people. And I thought that's very important, because in the end, that is the limit of synodality as it works now. You know, we had this wonderful stages, continental stages, the national stages, the local stages, and we heard so many wonderful things being said, and it was so life-giving to hear those things said. And then it gets winnowed down in this, synod hall, where there were a number of women who had an outsized influence, I will argue, but too many bishops so if you keep using the same players, you get, I think, in a lot of cases, the same old results. Anyway, things went forward, but they could go better if we didn't have quite so many people that are bishops at the synod. And then in 2018, Pope Francis changed the way that the bishops worked with each other at synods. So this is the first time it gets changed since 1965, when Paul VI put this in place. And so now the bishops have a deliberative role instead of consultative role. The whole church discerns. This is what it says in the document. And in the old days, we all know, under like John Paul II and Benedict, the Pope just wrote, he wrote what he was going to write. But the final document now, the bishops, whatever they decide, can become part of ordinary magisterium, although that didn't work in 2019 with the Amazon. So that's, again, the limits of what has been put forth. And then we know that the voting members of the synod do not have to be ordained. So again, Pope Francis, you can see his strategy. He actually does it, puts 2 non-ordained male religious superiors in place, and then also puts it into a constitution. And then Praedicate Evangelium is in 2022, a new constitution, which kind of took the CDF down a couple notches. Evangelization becomes the highest office. And then Vatican offices can be headed by lay people, it says. Synodality is the way for the church. And then he starts putting more and more women in the curia. So now, I remember when I first did a study of this, there was less than 3% of women in any position of authority in the church. Well, it's not 1 in 4, but 1 in 4 employees is female in the curia, but that doesn't mean they all have positions of authority. So, but there's a lot more than there used to be. Let's just put it that way. And then another very important move was Ladaria went out of the CDF and he put in Fernandez. And basically he said something really interesting. He said, those who came before you used immoral methods. That's a powerful statement. He said, I want you to do something very different. He said, I don't want you using control to get everybody in the same wavelength. I want you to bring these different ideas and thoughts together and let them gel and work themselves into our dialogues. And then, I love this picture, Cardinal Burke. On October 2nd, there were 5 cardinals who sent Pope Francis a letter. It was in the summer, and they made it public. But then when Pope Francis made his reply to them, they didn't make that public. So on October 2nd, Pope Francis makes the reply to these Dubia 5 public. And he says 2 very important things here. He says, we could be open to blessing same-sex marriage relationships, and women's ordination to the priesthood can be studied. And it goes around, and I put the language here because not every media outlet even reported on this, but so Pope Francis says, on the other hand, to be rigorous, let us recognize that a clear and authoritative doctrine on the exact nature of a definitive statement has not yet been fully developed. So you see how he's going to get around it. He's not going to go straight at John Paul's idea. He's going to go around, what does it mean to have a definitive statement? So you see he's begun the workaround. And then Burke and a bunch of other people like Burke held an October 3rd summit called the Synod Babel, which was their commentary on how Pope Francis was single-handedly bringing the church down. And then before and during the synod, we had lots of women's advocates groups in town. So we had, Women's Ordination Worldwide, Women's Walk was there, Discerning Deacons were there. We had the Canway, the Catholic Network for Women's Equality. We Are Church International was there. Spirit and Bounded had a lot of events through the course of a week. And I just want to make sure I don't miss, I probably missed a lot of people. Catholics for Choice was there. And also people who were really bringing attention to the fact that the clergy sex abuse crimes have not yet been solved in the church. And this case with Mark Rupnik was, very much out there as the synod was going on. So what did we see and what did we hear during the actual synod? So the first thing you have to know is that Pope Francis ordered a sort of a media blackout. He basically said to participants, don't talk to the journalists, fast from that, which made a really big barrier for journalists. Listening to what they had to say. I mean, they would try to, talk to some of them. Some people did talk anonymously, but not too many. And a lot of them just simply would not talk, which made it really hard. The normal stories that we would get, somebody talking about what they knew about the synod or what they heard, those things they were really hard, and it wasn't coming out in the way that they normally do. And that was very difficult. But what made this synod synodal? So we heard this many times, but it really did make a difference. So prior synods, you've had this like theater space and all the bishops are down there and the cardinals are in the front and then the lay people are way in the back. So there was round tables, 35 of them for the participants, 365. And the difference was they could speak freely without interruption. And then there were periods of silence. So the normal inclination of mostly bishops to sort of clamp down on people who weren't speaking in a way they wanted them to speak was stopped, because this was the way it was supposed to run. And there was a lot of prayer and spirituality throughout. And then there was a lot of advanced technology, which is really interesting. So everybody got their own tablet and nobody could change tablets. And it had, all their documents in it. It kept their votes confidential. There were 4 televisions per table, so they didn't have to strain their neck to find out who was talking. And then there was instantaneous translations for all the various different languages being spoke. And so I think the technology was really, quite a step up for the normal. When you go to a synod, at least my experience has been it's very 50 years old, they're back at 50 years ago, but now it seems to have really moved up. And there are symbols. For instance, in the opening mass and the closing mass, the women and the laity went first. And so that's very different from having this rows and rows of cardinals and bishops going first. A very good symbol, I think. And of course, we had the grumblings. This is something that Chris White was able to learn about a little bit, and some other people as well. So some of the bishops in the Synod Hall found the listening was tedious. This is not good. They didn't like listening to the emotional pleas. They thought that was annoying. Some walked out. There were heated exchanges on LGBTQ plus inclusion and justice. So as we might have expected, what we were hearing at the press briefings was everything was harmonious. It's wonderful. The birds were singing. We knew that probably wasn't true. And so there were people that did see that didn't happen. So we have some first women at the synod. Of course, Sister Natalie Picard is the first, to take up the undersecretary at the synod. She's the first woman who would have voted. And honestly, she made so much happen behind the scenes. I mean, because of her, I'm sure she led this effort to get another 54 women invited to be voters at the synod. So she has done tremendous work for the synod. And not to mention, we're going to give her our Louis Trivison Award next Tuesday. So anyway, she deserves much more than that, but it's we really owe her a great gift of thanks. And then we had Sister Maria and Miss Momoko, who were also delegates, presidential delegates. And so they presided over the synod. There was, I think, 7 altogether, so 5 men and these 2 women. And so 1 lay woman and 1 sister presided over the synod, and that was a pretty big deal. And then we had some beautiful firsts. So we have this first, for the first time, the Pope meets with Marianne Duddy Burke and the Rainbow Catholics. And you may know Marianne is from Dignity USA. I just wept when I saw this. I was so happy, and she wept. She said the Pope was incredibly gracious, and what a symbol for people who have worked in the shadows of the church for decades, ministering to people who are pushed to the shadow for decades. For the Pope to meet her, it was a very public and statement about the Pope's sense of inclusion for LGBTQI people. And then we also had Sister Janine, who got to meet the Pope. I also cried about this. And I thought, oh, the Pope was so lucky to get to meet her. Sister Janine is another person who has worked for and suffered greatly for years and years and decades, really, working ministry for LGBTQI people. And, and finally, she also got her her meeting with the Pope. And he has, of course, written to New Ways and to Sister Janine, and he had said he wanted to meet her. So that was really, really, really wonderful. Just like a high point for me. We had allies at the Synod. Cardinal Hollerich really threw out some very good challenges, and I'm going to tell you just a few. He said, the usual clericals, when clericalism reigns, clericals in this sense of the word only want to maintain the status quo. And then there's no possibility that you can actually go forward in mission. So he calls the clerics down. And then I really like this because this started at the second, when there was 3 parts to the Synod. And so during the second part is when they began talking about women in ministry, lay people in ministry. And so he says to them that day, most of us are men, but men and women receive the same baptism and the same Spirit. And this is something that, imaging in Christ, that has been part of church teaching, that women didn't image Christ. And of course, Phyllis Zagano brings that out. But he says the baptism of women is not inferior to the baptism of men. So therefore, how do we make sure they are an integral part of the missionary church? And then he asks, I think this is really important. I don't know that I've ever heard any other church man say this, but he says, how do we men perceive the richness of these charisms that the Holy Spirit has given to women? Or the way that we act, because of our past education, our family upbringing, our experiences, our prejudices, the stereotypes that we learn in our culture? I mean, that's the gospel, is unlearning those things. So he brings that up to them. And I thought that was wonderful. And he asked, do we feel enriched or threatened when we're working with women, when we share a mission with them? So he really laid out the challenges, I thought, beautifully. And then he goes on to say, because most of us are ordained ministers, what's the relationship between the ordained ministry and other baptized ministries? He said, are we ready to accept that all parts of the body are important? So, again, he's trying to level the playing field for everyone at the Synod. And then another really important ally at the Synod was Timothy Radcliffe, a Dominican. And I'm not going to tell you everything he said, but I thought 2 things he said stuck out for me. So he's, again, during one of the sessions that's beginning, and I think it was toward the end, he was saying, basically, I know a lot of you are troubled about tradition and we're throwing it away. And he said, then he uses Benedict, which I think is beautiful. He says, Benedict said the static version is legalistic, propositional, and ahistorical, relevant for all times and places. But the latter, the one we want, is personalist, sacramental, rooted in history, and therefore can be interpreted with a historical consciousness. So this is challenging those who are conservative and stubborn, saying, even your best pope is, would challenge you on that. And then this other moment that was so touching to me, and I just wept when I heard this. A woman had somebody had gotten up and told the story of a young woman who committed suicide because she was bisexual and did not feel welcomed. And he said, I wept. And many of us were weeping. And he said, I hope it changed us. And, unfortunately, I think for the people that weren't going to be changed, maybe it didn't. Maybe it did help some people along. But he said, the Holy Father reminds us, all are welcome. Todos, todos, todos. And so the actual synthesis. This is the starting point for the next 11 months. So there were convergences already reached. And so they're going to take the most urgent questions forward. And how they decide that, I have some clues from the text, but it's not entirely sure. And it says, this is going to be in the hands of Episcopal conferences, hierarchical structures of Eastern Catholic churches, local churches, and the Secretariat of the Synod. So that's not very helpful. I wish there was more influence again from the people of God, and I'm not sure if there will be, but this is what it says, so we'll see. But I think the high and low notes from our perspective, from Future Church, is that women's inclusion is urgent. That's important. Women deacons go forward, even though, there was some, contradictions around that. The needs of the local church rise to the top, and that's really going to be important. Most of these reforms are not going to happen from Rome. They're going to happen in the Amazon, and it's already is to some degree. They're going to happen in Germany. They're going to happen in local churches. And then those of us who have out-of-touch bishops, we're going to be suffering under that system. Hopefully they'll throw enough breadcrumbs our way that we can also make some changes. But there was no mention of women ordination to the priesthood, even though we know it was discussed. Why? It's not clear. If we're supposed to be talking about everything, that should have been in the document. And then this blow that I was crying. I mean, it was so hard to see this, that the language LGBTQ had been used all along in all the discussions. It had been used in the Instrumentum Laboris, but it was stripped from this final document, and that was just heartbreaking. Oh, oopsie. Nope. I didn't want to do that. Hold on a second. Let me share again. Sorry about that. Not sure why that happened. Okay. So let's go here. So the document is 40 pages long, 3 sections. So we have a part on synodality, a part on discipleship and missionaries, and then one they call building communities. So the second part is focuses on women, which is, of course, maybe for me and you, the most important, but there are other important parts to this. So synodality, here are the subheadings that are underneath it, okay? So I only focused in this discussion on the parts about synodality. So they had sort of agreements, considerations, and then proposals. So in terms of synodality, they said it's clear that some people are afraid they will be forced to change, fear losing power. And so they give this example of the Ecclesial Conference of Amazon as a synodality that's at work now. And so there are, again, there are people that need to clarify what we mean by the word, and then study the differences between the Latin churches and the Eastern churches. And the proposals are along this line. So we want to involve clergy in synodality. Wow. But that's the truth. I mean, we all know that bishops and priests did not, get involved in this. And so they need to make an effort in that. Make more room for young people, have people look at the International Theological Commission's documents on synodality. They're very good. And then here's one I put in blue because, and you'll see it at the end, I put a few of these things in blue. So when they actually say we've got to do something before the next synod, I put those off into a separate space. So it's actually got a timeline right in this document. Now, how how many other things will actually go along that timeline, it's not clear. But when they say it, I guess we can assume that that's actually going to get done. So they're going to create this intercontinental special commission of theological and canonical experts ahead of the next synod to look at the questions that come up. And then we need to train people and make liturgical language more accessible, widen community prayer beyond the Mass, which is interesting, make Vatican II teachings better known, rethink diaconal ministry, create shared frameworks for decentralization, new paradigms for engagement of indigenous, let's not colonize them anymore, engage in concrete projects for the integration of migrants, and combat racism and xenophobia. So, and include those who are harmed. I wish they would have done that at this synod, included many of the people that we talk about at this synod. That was a real shortfall of this synod as well. And then there are proposals for the Eastern churches. So they want to create a permanent council of the patriarchs and the major archbishops for the Pope. They want a joint commission of Eastern and Latin theologians to look at issues between the two, East and West. They want more curial positions given to Eastern Catholic churches, a common date for the Feast of Easter, ecumenical synod. They actually want a special synod dedicated to the Eastern Catholic churches. We want to devise a system where we all have the same martyrs or close to it, and that interchurch marriages and communion should be under consideration, but there were no formal proposals made on that. And then part two is the part where we'll look at a lot of things, but mostly I want to look at women in the church and laity in the church. So I thought this was really interesting. It says, Vatican II and all the magisterial documents since then make this distinctive mission for laity. We're supposed to sanctify the secular realities. But in the reality of pastoral practice at the parish, diocesan, and even universal levels, we're increasingly seeing lay people take up these tasks and ministries within the church itself. So we need to catch up. We're practicing something that doesn't have the proper theological and canonical provisions so that all this can be reconciled and somebody can't knock it all down. And then it says we need creativity in establishing ministries according to local church needs, not according to, from Rome, but in local churches. He wants to expand, they want to expand the responsibilities of the lector, and in that include preaching. So it's not clear. It looks like it may say outside of the Mass, but maybe inside of the Mass, because lectors are part of a Mass. So that's an interesting kind of, I'm not sure which way it goes for sure, but anyway, it does include preaching and establishing a ministry of married couples and bestow pastoral mandates on lay ministers. So, we're going to give them, they're doing the job, so let's give them the blessings. And then on women, there are many agreements. So we start off with, Galatians, all are one. We talk about Mary Magdalene, Mary Bethany, Mary. And then it says, women make up most of the people in our pews. Yeah, we knew that. There's a long history of women missionaries, saints, theologians, and mystics as powerful source. Yes. Women cry out for justice in societies. Yes. Women spoke of a church that wounds. Clericalism and a chauvinistic mentality create these, scars. And so that was very important to see that come out. Where dignity and justice are undermined in relationships between men and women in the church, we weaken our credibility. Amen. Don't repeat the mistake of talking about women as an issue or an object or a problem. Yeah. Amen. So the considerations. So this is beyond the agreements. There's considerations. So the churches all over the world, this is really important, have expressed a clear request that the active contribution of women would be recognized and valued, and that their pastoral leadership increase in all areas of the church's life and mission. So if we need new ministries, who should discern and at what levels and in what ways? So they ask the questions that are to go forward in the next 11 months. And then it says different positions were expressed regarding women's access to the diaconal ministry. And we heard the usual, it's unacceptable because it's not within the tradition. We're worried about anthropological confusion. I'm not worried about that. And probably you aren't either, but these are the contradictions that come up. But there's also, we know that it's an opening the access for women would restore the practice of the early church. Somebody's been reading Phyllis Zagano, and it is an appropriate and necessary response to the signs of the times, faithful to the tradition, and one that would find an echo in many of the hearts and who seek new energy and vitality in the church. So yes, there's a lot of, and the paragraphs dealing with this got the most no votes, but it still got a majority. And so we still have a lot of allies that want to see this go forward in the church. And so here are the proposals. Urgent to make sure women can participate in the decision-making processes and assume the roles of responsibility. We need theological and pastoral research on access of women to the diaconate. So he talks about what's been done before, but I surely hope they expand that beyond what's already been done. But we still have not seen what came out of the 2016 what came out in 2020 as a result of the 2016 commission. So it would be good to know what's in there. But anyway, labor injustice and unfair remuneration is an important issue. We need women's access to formation programs, and we need to integrate women into seminary teaching and training. Yep, we sure do. Ensure that liturgical texts and church documents are more attentive to the use of language, which under Benedict, we stripped a bunch of it out. We need to put that back in, but also includes a range of the narratives and the images that draw more widely on women's experience. So yeah, we know that the lectionary is missing the story of women, including on Easter. We don't even tell the whole story of Mary Magdalene, which just baffles me. But we need to get all those things put back in. And then we need to ensure that women can be judges in all canonical processes. And then on women religious, it says to revise this document on the relationship between the religious and the bishops. So what that means, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, thinking it's going to give them much more equal, relationship to one another, but it's not clear. Through the synodal process, create forms of collaboration between the bishops' conferences and the conferences superiors. And I'm sure the conferences of superiors and major superiors will be happy to do that as long as it's not bishops lording over them. Establishing councils and advisory bodies from lay associations, and ordained ministers monitor and strengthen the church's charismatic dimension. Yeah, they're going to monitor it. Yep. Things like that are hard to read in all of this. Oopsie, no. Okay. Oopsie, sorry about that. On priests and deacons, here are the proposals. They want to know how the diaconal ministry has been implemented since Vatican II. Some places have no deacons, some places deacons do one thing, and another place they do another thing. So they need, and they also feel like they need this better distinction between the permanent and transitional diaconate. So we need a deeper study of the diaconate, and then the question of access for women. So they need to, so my worst fear is that they'll look at it and say, well, let's not have any deacons doing anything at the Eucharist or something like that, which would be a terrible thing. And then we'll let women join, or they'll, some configuration like that. Hopefully that will not happen. But they also need a thorough review of the formation programs for ordained ministry. Synodal style needs to come in. And then they need to have local churches identify processes that will allow for regular audits of priests and deacons. So that's important. And then this is very surprising to me. Consider reinserting priests who have left the ministry and recognize their formation and experience. So that's kind of a big deal for especially Future Church, who's been working for a long time to reassert the priesthood of married priests. And so I think that's a step forward. And I like the ones on the bishops, especially the ones that have legal in it. So it says in a process that that's a legal process. We haven't defined it yet, but we need to create structures and processes for a regular review of the bishop's performance. So that's very important for accountability. And then we want to make the Episcopal Council and the Diocesan Pastoral Council mandatory, so that the bodies can exercise co-responsibility, and that they want to do legally. So they want to make these things mandatory and put them in legal terms, and then review the criteria for selecting candidates to the episcopate. We know that that's been said many times, and we'd like to see that expanded with consultation with the faithful more and more. And then there's a whole bunch of other things, like let's rethink how ad limina visits are carried out. The Roman Curia needs to consult more with the bishops. We need to establish evaluations for the work of the pontifical representatives by the local churches. So the nuncios, and then they want enhanced Council of Cardinals. And then the other thing is lines with something else that was said before about within Evangelium Praedicate, which is to decide, do we really need to ordain prelates to be in the Roman Curia? So this is another way of saying, yeah, we can let lay people go for it. Then the last part is about building community. And here's where we get into some of the issues around LGBTQI sexuality in this very interesting language. So on formation, they want, again, priority given to joint formation programs that include laity, consecrated, and ordained. That, I think, is a very important point. Priority should be given to it. So how much priority, I don't know if it'll happen until next year, probably not, but a range of members of the people of God, especially women, should be represented in formation programs for ordained ministries. We need adequate standards for selecting candidates. If you saw the study out today, as our priests are getting more, and as they get younger, they're more and more and more conservative, and they have really no relationship to Vatican II, or barely any relationship to Vatican II. So we're going the wrong direction there. And so that formation should be not in an artificial environment as it is now, but we need to have people being formed in community. And then here's another one that is said to need to be done before next assembly. So in preparation, those responsible for the initial and ongoing formation of priests should undertake and assess how the synodal process is being received by the priests, and then propose changes that will promote the exercise of authority in a style that is appropriate to a synodal church. So in the States, they're going to be up against a lot of problems with the younger priests, for sure. But anyway, this is going to happen before the next consultation. So I thought this was important because this is a paragraph that's in the agreements. Now, people agreed on this. They didn't use the language LGBTQI, but they did say this. They said in matters relating to identity and sexuality, because they raise new questions, sometimes the anthropological categories that we have developed in the church are not able to grasp the new complexities emerging from experience or knowledge in the sciences. So it's important to take time to reflect on this and to invest our best energies in it without giving in to simplistic judgments that hurt the individuals and the body of the church, the body of Christ, or body of the church. And so, and then it talks about Jesus. So even when we don't know exactly how to do it, Jesus points the way. And so this whole thing goes into this, we got to get this done. So this is another thing that we should see happening before the next synod comes together. We propose that initiatives enabling shared discernment on controversial, doctrinal, pastoral, and ethical issues should be developed in light of the Word of God, and so forth. But this can be accomplished through in-depth discussions among experts with diverse skills and backgrounds in an institutional setting that protects confidentiality and promotes frank discussion, And when it is appropriate, it should involve, and it is appropriate in many cases, probably most, that it should involve people directly affected by the matters under consideration. So such initiatives should be set in motion before the next session of the assembly. So again, we had no one who was openly declaring that they were LGBTQI at this synod, although we certainly know that there were people there, but this is very important. You can't make these decisions without people in the room. And then there are, these many proposals around being a listening church. We need to, not just do it individually. It has to be made into a structure. And so there's a proposal for the establishment of a ministry of listening and accompaniment. And then it gives another example of an Episcopal prophet conference that says, we're going to encourage you to, on the question of polygamy and the accompaniment of people in polygamous unions to come together and talk to them about that. And then they have, information or proposals about the digital world. Some people are already doing it. Let's make sure that they're supported and accompanied. And then the structures for participation. So again, we're back to this idea of sexuality. And in Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis says this is a task that cannot be further delayed. This idea of the composition of participatory bodies. So the participation of baptized men and women living in complex situations of loving relationship can be expressed in different ecclesial services, which necessarily requires discerning, which is of various forms of exclusion currently practiced in the liturgical, pastoral, and educational and institutional framework that can be surmounted. In other words, how can we get past these roadblocks to the full expression of our of people living in, as they say, complex situations? So, is it, whether it's people living in, they're divorced and remarried, or they're LGBTQI, or they're living in a relationship where they're not married, just so many variations here. How do we take down the roadblocks? And so this discernment also concerns their exclusion from parish and diocesan community. So we want them back. And so they want, in this, it's very interesting, legislate the obligatory nature of pastoral councils so that we have the proper presence of laity and accountability in our churches, in our local churches. And then there's a bunch of stuff about the groupings of churches. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's how do we get, through this continental phase process, especially, we had groups of people in the room together that had never been in the room together. And we're bringing the Latin church and the Eastern churches together in brand new ways. And they're trying to figure out what structures do we need to make sure that occurs. And the same thing here, how do we integrate the bishops with this new idea of ecclesial assemblies? How do we get the bishops to hold this new model of church up? And, whether it's, and then they give some examples of how it's been done. And they actually hold up the Australian Plenary Council as one of those models that actually work pretty well. And so they're saying, we've got models. Let's integrate these things and go forward. And so before next year, we want to create these are the things that are specifically, told in the document. Create an intercontinental special commission of theological and canonical experts ahead of the next synod. The call to include women in decision-making and ministry is urgent. So the first one was in the first section. The call to include women is urgent. Now, it doesn't give a timeline, but the use of the word urgent, I thought was important. It's going to go forward. And in preparation for the next assembly, a consultation of those responsible for formation of priests needs to be undertaken. We need to figure out where priests are and all this and what we can do to help get them along on the synodal church. And then these initiatives enabling a shared discernment on the controversial doctrinal, pastoral, and ethical issues. So we need to get that moving. So those are 4 pretty important things to go forward. And I think, it does, if they actually get that much accomplished, that will be very interesting and very good. And so I want to just show you a little bit about what happened after the synod. We found from some participants talking about their experience, what was going on. And so we have Mueller, who said, people in the assembly are abusing the Holy Spirit. I love that. In order to introduce new doctrines such as the acceptance of homosexuality, women priests, and a change in church government. He doesn't like any of it. And then there was an unidentified participant that Christopher Lamb talked to, and he said, basically, in this document, the progressives got the process and the conservatives got the content. So that's a nice short way to look at it. I don't necessarily know if it carries through all the way, but just depends on what your expectations were in the first place. And then somebody who didn't vote, but who was there as an expert, he said the level of theological reflection and the depth of analysis of some of the concrete situations of some interventions, what some people were saying, were not very brilliant. So he, as a person who engages in that work, thought it could have been much better. And he was really struck by the fact that many people really weren't willing to draw consequences on this, this abandonment of the faith in Europe and North America by large numbers of baptized people. They didn't talk about it as much as he thought they should have. And Catherine Clifford did a really nice job at the Synod, I thought. She said some things that I thought were important. She said, and I think she said this in an interview with Josh McElwee and Chris White, she said, I never expected in my lifetime to see these issues being discussed. And that's parroted quite a few times by people inside the Synod. And so before the Synod, she said, so many of the women are doing diaconal tasks. Is not this the moment to consider the restoration of women's diaconal ministries? You can be sure she was saying it in the Synod. And then this whole issue of, the bishops being afraid to lose their power. She said, you have to distinguish. And many of the ones who are stubborn saying, women just want power. And she said, no. You have to distinguish between the two. She said, you can have power and exercise it and have absolutely no authority. And those of us in the Catholic Church know that to be a truism. And so she talks about, the fact that when bishops bring in and get a consensus by bringing in more people, the decision carries more weight and has more authority than a bishop doing it all by himself. And Helena Spuler said, I loved what she had to say. She said, first in 2019, she was out there with WALK and all of us with this group of Swiss sisters and sisters from Europe standing in front of the Synod's office saying, give Catholic women the right to vote. And she said, but it wasn't possible yet. But she said, and only 4 years after that, the doors of the Synod office were open for everybody, and we are able to go there to discuss our issues. She said, let's open more doors for women in the Catholic Church. And we know that she's very much in favor of women's ordination to the priesthood. So we know that in the Synod Hall, there were many people, including Helena, that talked about it. And then Father Arabater, who's one of my favorite priests in the whole world, said basically, and I'm so glad he's there because he's quite a compelling speaker. He said on LGBT issues, there's nothing closed. He said, nothing has been finalized. We're going to talk about it. And then on women, he said, it's time to go. He said, this is the moment to not kick this can down the road, but to go ahead and engage. So, and he's very much, I've heard him speak a number of times, very, brought me to tears on my knees. He's very much an advocate for women in the church. And so we've got a powerful ally in Father Arabater. And then I thought James Martin gave a very interesting interview in America. And he said, basically, really a powerful personal experience. He said, I listened carefully to people, what they had to say about LGBT people or about women. He said, just two topics, that I strongly disagreed with. So he's listening to them and he's working to be open and listening. But he said, and most people were friendly and kind, but 2 or 3 times people said and did things that not only made my eyebrows raise, but they were personally hurtful. And so I was thinking about, he has a lot of enemies in the hierarchy, has a lot of friends. And so he said, there was occasionally a temptation to despair. He said, I heard these uncharitable comments and I thought, are we ever going to make progress? And then he talked about his own sort of hesitations. He said, sometimes when I'm talking to the prelates, he said, I wasn't as straightforward as I would have liked to have been. He said, I felt like a little bit worried about saying what I thought. And he said, I'm sure others felt the same way. And so that was very interesting because I don't think of somebody like Martin being afraid to be straightforward, but he felt that. And he said in a few comments, not only bespoke opposition to the inclusion of LGBTQ people, but some people were outright fearful of, those who talk about it as ideology or the new colonization. Those folks were there too. And he said, so at the end, they had been using the terminology LGBTQI people all along. He said, all of a sudden, somebody comes up to him toward the end and early, and he says, the delegate said to me, it's out. And he said, what's out? What is? And he said, any mention of LGBT people. And so sure enough, the term was, stricken from the document, and it was very disappointing and I think very hurtful. He said it wasn't surprising given the fierce opposition, but he said, I can't understand. We talked about it. Why couldn't it just be included in the final synthesis? So here we definitely see that the conservatives got the upper hand, and I would say the minority voice there got the upper hand. And so he said, the next morning I prayed, and he thought, well, yeah, we didn't get the term, but there's a lot of the document that talks about reaching out, and so far it's far larger than, and I like this because this I think is true. What happened at the Synod is far larger than the synthesis document reflects. And I think that's true about women's influence in the document and so many other things. I've heard that said over and over again. The document really doesn't catch the dynamism that was there. And so I think that what he says is, I was surprised that things were talked about so extensively, and it's a major step forward. And so we know that Phyllis Zagano, she says, and she said this before the Synod, but when she was looking at the Instrumentum Laboris, but it's really important. There will be significant argumentation against ordaining women as deacons, but to say women cannot be ordained, only installed in some fake diaconal ministry, insults our baptismal equality. So she gets right out there and says it. And she says there's this false argument that's saying women cannot image Christ, therefore the restoring women to the diaconate cannot happen. She said it's implicitly, if not directly, the cause of the denigration and disrespect for women on every continent. Amen, sister. And then the last person I'm going to show you here is Massimo Fagioli. And I like his analysis that came out. He said, and because he gives some big views, and then he also talks about the presence of women. He said, and I totally agree with him on this, at the Synod, the presence of women was not a token. Their voices were really present. They were really heard. They were really visible. He said, we're at a very important juncture. I would have never imagined this kind of discussion happening. And so women is the issue in which Francis needs the most help. So, he's as much as he's very open-minded on LGBT language, his language on women is from another century. And we know that from one of the things he said at the end about, the Marian Petrin principle again. So he says Francis needs to be surrounded by women theologians. I couldn't agree more. But then in terms of the Synod's place in history, this resourcement, that reconnection with the important and very real past is very important. And he says this assembly differed fundamentally from the 29 that went before. it occupies a turning point in Catholic history from the last 2 centuries. So it's a big, big deal. This is a big change. So he goes through what Vatican I and II, and then he says the synodal church the synodal gathering that we just went through is really a marrying of those two and bringing in ecclesial synodality. So the people of God coming in to make decisions. He said, this is no longer the synod of bishops, but rather a synod with bishops. And so to the extent that that grows in a direction where more and more lay people and women are part of the synod and become really representative of all the church, I think that will be then we'll have honest synodality. And he said the final synthesis of this report, and all of us should remember this, should not be read in a fundamentalist chapter and verse way. And he says again what Jim says and a few other people, the relationship at this is between the synod, what happened at the synod, Pope Francis, and Fernandez at the CDF. He said that's more important to what's going to happen. He said, especially on the role of women and LGBT Catholics. The pre-synod responses to the dubia are just an example of what Francis is doing. He made this audience with Sister Janine Gramick and Marianne Duddy Burke. So that's more indicative of where he's going than Massimo thinks of the synthesis document. And at the same time, the Pope repeated once again this theory of the Marian and Petrine principle. And if you don't know what that means, it means that we're both made in the image of God, but women are made to do certain things, men are made to do certain things, and the two cannot meet. Men are leaders, women are receivers. So it's a very bad old theology, and it's hopefully people like the friend of Zavino, the friend of Pope Francis, as she challenged him and said, we don't need a theology of women. We already have a theology of women. So we need people like that to talk to him or to, get him to understand these things. And he said a new synod model has to find institutional stability, which we know. So I just want to bring up some things that Catherine Clifford said. She talked about the many things that are going to happen over the next 11 months. And she said, it's how we're going to be synodal, but this can't happen unless we really have a much greater integration of women. And we need more local initiatives. He said formation for the priesthood needs a major revamp. And we all know that. The bishops need conversion, and we need to change church structures and practices. But she thinks this will take a generation to make this change. So, that's a sort of practical consideration in all of this work. But I just want to make sure that we all remember that the call to include women coming out of the synod is urgent. And this picture was taken in front of the International Union of Superiors General. This is all the women who were at the synod. So I've got some ideas for action here, some things around lectionary, things that were brought up in the synod document that we can pull these levers. And then, of course, there are so many other things. But I wanted to go into the small group discussions so that we can come back and talk a little bit and then finish up for the evening. So these are the questions for your small group. Now, these are just suggestions. If you have something else that burning that you need to talk about, go ahead and talk about what you need to talk about. But my question for you is, what did you hear that was a call for hope, or cause for hope or joy or disappointment? What's the one issue that you want to see take priority this year? And then maybe what are some ideas that you've been thinking about that you could undertake individually or within your parish or community to make synodality a greater reality in the next 11 months? And then for Future Church and other organizations who are also very interested in this, what kind of resources do you need to help?